Sudden Enlightenment Followed by Gradual Cultivation, Tsung-Mi's Analysis of Mind, by Peter N. Gregory. As a Chan historian and later exponent of Shen Hui's teaching line, Guifeng Tsung-Mi, 780–841, upheld Shen Hui's claim that the southern line of Chan, founded by Huineng, was the authentic line of Chan transmission. According to his account contained in the Chan chart, the southern line is the true line in which the robe and dharma have been uninterruptedly transmitted over successive generations, from the time when the great master Huineng of Cao-Chi received the essence of Bodhidharma's teaching. Later, because Shenshu widely spread the gradual teaching in the north, it was called the southern line to distinguish it from the northern line of Shenshu. After the great priest Huineng died, the gradual teaching of the northern line was greatly practiced and thus became an obstacle to the widespread transmission of the sudden teaching. In the beginning of the Tianpao era, 742–756, Hotze, Shen Hui, entered Luoyang, and as soon as he proclaimed this teaching, made it known that the descendants of Shenshu were collateral and that their teaching was gradual. Since the two lines were being practiced side by side, people of the time wanted to distinguish between them. The use of the names northern and southern thus came about. Tsung-Mi goes on to report that in 796 an imperial commission determined that the southern line of Chan represented the orthodox transmission and established Shen Hui as the seventh patriarch, placing an inscription to that effect in the Shenlong temple. Tsung-Mi followed Shen Hui in criticizing the northern line for its sole emphasis on a graduated meditative regimen, to the neglect of sudden enlightenment altogether. Yet while he maintained that Shen Hui's teaching was sudden, he held that it contained a gradual component as well. In fact, he described Shen Hui's teaching in regard to practice and enlightenment as advocating the necessity of a sudden experience of enlightenment to be followed by a gradual process of cultivation, in which the practitioner's initial insight into his true nature is systematically deepened until it becomes integrated into every aspect of his life. In this chapter, I examine the context, content, and doctrinal basis of Tsung-Mi's theory of sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation. 1. Tsung-Mi's explication of sudden and gradual. Shen Hui's attack on the northern line of Chan issued in a period of intense and often bitter sectarian rivalry among the proponents of the different Chan lineages. In Tsung-Mi's day, the words sudden, dun, and gradual, qian, had become shibboleths of contending factions, whose mutual antagonism he described in martial imagery. Not only were Chan Buddhists divided against themselves, but according to Tsung-Mi, the Chinese Buddhist world as a whole was split between those who identified themselves with the scholastic traditions, such as the Huayan and Tiandai, and those who identified themselves with the practice-oriented tradition of Chan. Tsung-Mi was gravely distressed by the rivalry that divided Chinese Buddhists into contending camps, describing it as a situation in which Buddhist teachings had become a disease that often impaired the progress of the very people they purported to help. He perceived the primary split as lying between the scholastic traditions of Buddhist learning, Jiao, and the more practice-oriented tradition of Chan, which emphasized the necessity of the actualization of enlightenment in this very life. It was in an effort to resolve this division that Tsung-Mi wrote his Chan Preface, a work whose overall intent was to unify Jiao and Chan, Jiao Chan Yi Ji. As someone who had a foot in both camps, being traditionally reckoned as the fifth patriarch in both the Huayan tradition and the Hotze line of southern Chan, he was eminently qualified to undertake such a task. Tsung-Mi viewed the seemingly irreconcilable opposition between Subitism and gradualism as one of the major issues dividing Buddhists whose primary focus lay in the study and interpretation of the teachings, Jiao, from those whose primary focus lay in the personal realization of those teachings in practice, Chan, as well as pitting followers of the various Chan lineages against one another. As he makes clear at the outset, this is one of the main issues that he seeks to address in the Chan Preface. Although, as a successor in the Hotze line of southern Chan, Tsung-Mi must be regarded as a partisan on the issue, his ecumenical approach stands in sharp contrast to the polemical style of Shen Hui. He cites the famous parable of the blind men and the elephant to characterize the situation in which the proponents of the various positions argue with one another, suggesting that the problem is really one of perspective. He contends that sudden, dun, and gradual, qian, are complementary rather than mutually exclusive terms. After making the further point that the terms have a broad range of meaning that varies according to context, he goes on to enumerate a number of different contexts in which they are used. Tsung-Mi's standpoint in explicating the different meanings of dun and jian is broad and inclusive, seeking to establish a larger context in which the various and seemingly contradictory positions in regard to the meaning of these terms can be validated as integral parts of a manifold whole, in which the trunk, tail, leg, side, and so forth are all seen as belonging to the same elephant. In doing so, he maintains that no one position has an exclusive claim to the truth, but that it is only when all of them are taken together that we can arrive at a true understanding of something as complex as the nature of religious experience. Any one position taken up to the exhaustion of the others is, by that very fact, invalid. When that position is understood within a context that includes the others, however, it will be seen to offer its own unique perspective, wherein lies its own particular validity. Tsung-Mi remarks that he has encountered many Buddhists who use the terms sudden and gradual in a thoroughly uncritical and indiscriminate way, and his analysis is based on the assumption that much of the emotional intensity that enveloped the controversy could be dispelled by clarifying the different meanings that the terms have in different contexts. Then it would be seen that the various sides in the controversy are, in fact, talking about different things. Tsung-Mi says that we should first differentiate between how these terms are used in doctrinal discussions of the Buddhist teaching and how they are used in discussions of the practice and realization of the Buddhist teaching as it is carried out by Buddhists. Tsung-Mi is here making the point that to claim that the Avataṃsaka Sutra, for example, represents the sudden teaching, Dun Jiao, is to use the word sudden in a way quite different from saying that Shan Hui's teaching emphasized the experience of sudden enlightenment, Dun Wu. In contrast to his predecessors in the Huayan tradition, Qi-Yan, Fa-Zang, and Chengguan, Tsung-Mi does not establish the sudden teaching as a separate category in his system of doctrinal classification, Pan-Jiao. Rather, like the 8th century reviver of the Tiantai tradition, Chan 711 to 782, he maintains that in a doctrinal context the terms sudden and gradual refer to methods by which the Buddha taught, not to separate teachings. He says that the term sudden teaching refers to the fact that whenever the Buddha encountered a person of superior capacity and insight, he would directly reveal the true Dharma to him, enabling him to become suddenly awakened, Dun Wu, to the fact that his true nature, Chen Xing, is wholly identical with that of all Buddhas. Sudden thus refers to the method by which the Buddha directly revealed the truth to persons of the highest spiritual aptitude. Tsung-Mi identifies the sudden teaching with the teaching of those sutras that expound the Tathagata doctrine, such as the Avataṃsaka, Yuan-Chui, Perfect Enlightenment, Shurangama, Ganavyuha, Srimala, and Tathagata. He adds that this teaching is identical with the highest form of Chan teaching, that of the Hotsa line founded by Shen Hui. The gradual teachings, on the other hand, refer to those teachings that the Buddha addressed to persons of average or inferior capacity. The term gradual thus refers to the method by which the Buddha made skillful use of expedient means to lead these people through a graduated series of teachings, beginning with the most elementary and culminating in the most profound. Tsung-Mi goes on to point out that within the context of Buddhist practice, the terms sudden and gradual are used in a variety of ways. He then enumerates 5 different ways in which these terms are used in regard to practice and enlightenment. 1. Gradual cultivation, followed by sudden enlightenment, Jianshu, Dongwu. Tsung-Mi illustrates this position by recourse to 2 analogies. 1. It is like chopping down a tree. One gradually cuts away at it until it suddenly falls. 2. It is like traveling to a distant city. One gradually approaches it with each step until one day one suddenly arrives. As the analogies make clear, gradual cultivation refers to the process by which one moves towards the ultimate goal of enlightenment, while sudden enlightenment refers to the moment of experience in which that goal is realized. 2. Sudden cultivation followed by gradual enlightenment, Dunshu, Jianwu. The analogy that Tsung-Mi uses to illustrate this position is that of someone learning archery. He says that sudden refers to the act of aiming directly at the bullseye, which he says is used as a metaphor for resolving to attain supreme enlightenment, while gradual refers to the process by which one's aim gradually becomes perfected until one can hit the bullseye consistently without missing. Tsung-Mi further explains that sudden here has to do with the intentionality, yun shin, of one's practice, not with the sudden perfection of meritorious practices. In this context, dun could be better rendered as direct or immediate. The use of the word dun in this case corresponds to its use within the system of Tiantai meditation, where it was classically defined by Guan Ding in his preface to the Moho Chi Quan, the great calming and contemplation. The sudden perfect, calming and contemplation from the very beginning takes ultimate reality as its object. 3. Gradual cultivation and gradual enlightenment, Jianshu, Jianwu. Here, Tsung-Mi uses the analogy of climbing a 9-story tower. With each story that one mounts, one's gaze extends further. This possession emphasizes the fact that not only is the process that leads to enlightenment graduated, but enlightenment itself is also subject to gradation. Tsung-Mi points out that in the first three cases, the term enlightenment refers to the enlightenment of complete realization, Zhengwu, in contradistinction to the enlightenment of initial insight, Jie-wu. He explains these terms in his subcommentary to the Scripture of Perfect Enlightenment, Yuan-chui Jing Ta Shu Zhao. Because one first has an initial experience of enlightenment, Zhu Yin Jie-wu, one engages in religious practice based on that experience. And as soon as one's practice is completed and one's task perfected, Xingman Kung Yuan, one realizes the fulfillment of enlightenment, Jite Zhengwu. Tsung-Mi's explanation of these qualitatively different kinds of enlightenment presupposes a three-staged model of the path. 1. Initial insight, Jie-wu. 2. Gradual cultivation, Jian-shu. And 3. Final enlightenment, Zhengwu. 4. Sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation, Dunwu Jian-shu. This is the position that Tsung-Mi identifies with Shenhui, and it will be treated in detail below. Here, enlightenment refers to initial experience of insight, Jie-wu. 5. Sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation, Dunwu Dunshu. This position applies only to those of the highest capacity and aspiration whose initial insight, Jie-wu, is so penetrating and profound as to at once be equal to fully realized enlightenment, Zhengwu, thus making any further cultivation unnecessary. Tsung-Mi points out, however, that this is only possible because such persons have already engaged in a long process of spiritual cultivation in past lives. Hence there is a gradual component in this position as well. Tsung-Mi says that in this case obstructions are suddenly cut off, just as myriad strands of silk are suddenly severed when cutting a piece of silk cloth, and that virtuous practices are suddenly perfected just as myriad strands of silk are suddenly dyed with color when a piece of silk cloth is submerged in dye. He then quotes Shenhui twice. When one sees the essence that is without thoughts, one will not follow the arising of things. If, in a single moment of thought, one becomes one with one's intrinsic nature, then the practice of the 80,000 perfections will all simultaneously come into effect. Tsung-Mi's analysis is useful for providing a conceptual framework for making sense out of the confusion that has often marked discussions of the sudden gradual controversy. It does so by distinguishing the variety of ways in which the terms sudden and gradual can be applied to cultivation and enlightenment, making it clear that dun and jian have entirely different meanings when used in different contexts. In the first three cases, all examples of zhengwu, enlightenment can refer to both the process of its actualization as well as the experience in which it is finally consummated. In the first case, that of gradual cultivation followed by sudden enlightenment, enlightenment clearly refers to the final goal that is suddenly attained only after the consummation of a long process of cultivation. However, in the second and third cases, sudden cultivation followed by gradual enlightenment, and gradual cultivation and gradual enlightenment, enlightenment refers to the process by which enlightenment is consummated, and accordingly corresponds to what Tsung-Mi refers to as gradual cultivation in the first case. The meaning of cultivation also varies with context. Whereas in the first and third cases it refers to the process of the actualization of enlightenment, in the second it refers to the intentionality informing that process. Moreover, as Tsung-Mi points out, the enlightenment in question in the first three cases is what he calls zhengwu, the enlightenment of complete realization. This term is contrasted with jiewu, the enlightenment of initial insight, the kind of enlightenment that is instanced in the fourth and fifth cases, those of sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation, and sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation. Whereas jiewu is always a sudden experience of insight, zhengwu can be either gradual or sudden, depending on whether it is regarded from the standpoint of the process of the actualization of final enlightenment or the actual experience of that enlightenment. In the cases in which zhengwu is regarded as gradual, it is synonymous with gradual cultivation, jian-shu. Tsung-Mi's distinction between these two types of enlightenment posits three stages in the course of religious practice. 1. Initial awakening. 2. Gradual cultivation. And 3. Fully realized enlightenment. In the fifth case, that of sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation, the first and third stage are collapsed together, obviating the necessity of stage 2 as a discrete stage of practice. Although he makes no reference to classical Buddhist divisions of the path, the distinctions Tsung-Mi introduces correspond, in structure if not in content, to the traditional threefold division of the path into darshana, bhavana, and ashaksha marga. For all his emphasis on the importance of the experience of sudden enlightenment, Tsung-Mi here articulates a position that has more in common with that of Kamalashila than with that of Mohoyen, that is, with the gradualist rather than the subitist camp in the Tibetan controversy. It is also worth noting that Tsung-Mi does not mention a stage of preparatory practice, prayoga marga, prior to the initial insight, jie-wu. Although he does not discuss his reasons, it is clear that he felt that such practices were not necessary for the experience of sudden enlightenment to occur, which of course is not to say that he advocated that they should therefore be discarded. There were ample examples in Chan literature of persons who had been suddenly enlightened without first having engaged in preparatory practices, the most notable being that of Huineng, the archetype of Chan religious experience, at least within the southern line. Tsung-Mi cautioned to add, however, that such cases were only possible because such people had cultivated good roots in past lives. More important, the fact that Tsung-Mi does not mention preparatory practices in his analysis of the stages of the path emphasizes the radical transformation that he believes takes place upon the experience of sudden enlightenment. For Tsung-Mi, it is only after such an experience that true Buddhist practice can begin. There is thus a fundamental difference between practices engaged in prior to this experience and those engaged in after it. And it is based on the transformative power of the initial insight of jie-wu and the qualitative difference that it effects in one's practice that Tsung-Mi criticizes the practice followed in the northern line of Chan as inauthentic. Finally, although Tsung-Mi is careful to distinguish between the uses of the term tun in its scholastic and practical contexts, there is still a connection between the two usages that needs to be brought out. That is, the sudden teaching for Tsung-Mi is the teaching that does not rely upon any expedients, but directly reveals the true nature, which is the content of the Buddha's enlightenment, as well as that into which the Buddhist practitioner has insight when he experiences jie-wu. The sudden teaching is thus the teaching that enables one to experience sudden enlightenment. 2. Sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation. For Tsung-Mi, sudden enlightenment did not obviate the need for the cultivation of a graduated series of stages of religious practice. In fact, according to him, the experience of sudden enlightenment is the indispensable foundation upon which such practice has to be carried out. As he says in the Chan Preface, if one engages in spiritual cultivation without having first experienced enlightenment, then it is not authentic practice. In other words, it is the experience of sudden enlightenment, i.e. jie-wu, that authenticates Buddhist practice. But this experience is identified by Tsung-Mi as being only the first stage in a 10-stage process culminating in the attainment of Buddhahood. Tsung-Mi uses 3 analogies in the Chan chart to illustrate what he means by sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation. The first, adapted from the Awakening of Faith, is that even though the wind that has stirred the originally tranquil surface of the ocean into movement ceases suddenly, the motion of its waves only subsides gradually. The second is that even though the sun appears suddenly, the morning frost only melts gradually. The last, which Tsung-Mi borrows from Shen Hui, is that even though an infant possesses all of its limbs and faculties intact the moment it is born, it only learns to master their use gradually. Doctrinally, Tsung-Mi claims that the teaching of sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation is based on the Awakening of Faith, Scripture of Perfect Enlightenment, and Avataṃsaka Sutra. Tsung-Mi's fullest description of sudden enlightenment occurs in the Chan chart, where he says, while awakening from delusion is sudden, the transformation of an unenlightened person, Fan, into an enlightened person, Sheng, is gradual. Sudden enlightenment means that although beings have been deluded from time without beginning, recognizing the 4 elements as their body and deluded thoughts as their mind, and taking them both together as constituting their self, when they meet a good friend, Kalyana Mitra, who explains to them the meaning of the absolute and conditioned aspects of suchness, the nature in its phenomenal appearance, the essence in its functioning, then they at once realize that their own marvelous knowing and seeing is the true mind, that the mind, which is from the beginning empty and tranquil, boundless and formless, is the Dharmakaya, that the non-duality of body and mind is the true self, and that they are no different from all Buddhas by even a hair. Thus, for Tsung-Mi, sudden enlightenment is the experience in which one sees that one's true nature is, and always has been, wholly identical with that of all Buddhas. The paradigm for this experience is, of course, the Buddha's own enlightenment. The passage that Tsung-Mi cites in both the Chan Preface and the Inquiry into the Origin of Man Yuan Zhenlun, as canonical authority for his description of the highest teaching of the Buddha, comes from the Avataṃsaka and was especially valued in the Chan tradition, as it was believed to contain the first words uttered by the Buddha after his enlightenment. O sons of Buddha, there is no place where the wisdom of the Tathagata does not reach. Why? Because there is not a single sentient being that is not fully endowed with the wisdom of the Tathagata. It is only on account of their deluded thinking, erroneous views, and attachments that they do not succeed in realizing it. When they become free from deluded thinking, the all-comprehending wisdom, the spontaneous wisdom, and the unobstructed wisdom will then be manifest before them. At that time the Tathagata, with his unobstructed pure eye of wisdom, universally beheld all sentient beings throughout the universe and said, "How amazing! How amazing! How can it be that these sentient beings are fully endowed with the wisdom of the Tathagata, and yet, being ignorant and confused, do not know it, do not see it? I must teach them the noble path, enabling them to be forever free from deluded thinking, and to achieve for themselves the seeing of the broad and vast wisdom of the Tathagata within themselves, and so to be no different from the Buddhas." The significance of this passage for Tsung-Mi lay in the fact that it establishes that the content of the Buddha's enlightenment consisted in his realization that all sentient beings already fully possess the enlightened wisdom of the Buddha within themselves, and are therefore fundamentally identical with all Buddhas. Sentient beings' enlightenment thus lies in their awakening of this intrinsic Buddha wisdom within themselves. Although the Buddha's enlightenment is the paradigm for sentient beings' experience of enlightenment, it must also be pointed out that what Tsung-Mi means by sudden enlightenment differs significantly from the enlightenment experienced by the Buddha, which all Buddhist traditions have characterized as supreme, perfect enlightenment, Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. As we have noted, sudden enlightenment in the context of Tsung-Mi's theory of sudden enlightenment, followed by gradual cultivation, refers to Jie-wu, initial awakening, only the first stage in Tsung-Mi's 10-stage process of spiritual cultivation. The Buddha's enlightenment, on the other hand, corresponds to Zhengwu, the final culmination of enlightenment. For Tsung-Mi, the necessity of commencing a process of gradual cultivation following the initial experience of enlightenment, Jie-wu, is based on the sheer tenacity of the karmic residue of past actions, the vasana or shih-chieh, which have thoroughly permeated the alaya vijnana, or store consciousness over the course of innumerable lifetimes. Thus, although the initial experience of enlightenment is sudden, one must still engage in a long process of cultivation in order to extirpate the deeply rooted seeds of the false view of a substantial self that have become ingrained in our mentality. As Tsung-Mi says in the Chan chart, even though one suddenly realizes that the Dharmakaya, the true mind, is wholly identical with Buddha, still, since for numerous kalpas one has deludedly clung to the four elements as constituting oneself, so that this view has become second nature and is difficult to do away with all at once, one must cultivate oneself on the basis of this experience of enlightenment. When one has reduced it and further reduced it until there is nothing left to reduce, then it is called attaining Buddhahood. Even though the practitioner has gained an insight into his own true nature, realizing his identity with all Buddhas, he is still not fully liberated, for he has yet to root out the seeds of his misperception of himself as a separate and self-existing entity. Although he has seen that this view is illusory, his behavior and entire mode of being in the world are still predicated on this false view of the self, to which he has become habituated by a long process of conditioning. It is therefore necessary to embark upon a program of gradual cultivation that will eliminate the seeds of this misconception, so that his original insight into his true nature can be fully and freely manifested in his every action. Gradual cultivation is thus the process by which one's initial insight is integrated into one's personality. 3. The doctrinal basis of Tsung-Mi's theory. Doctrinally, Tsung-Mi's explanation of sudden enlightenment is based on the Tathagata-garbha, whereas his explanation of gradual cultivation is based on the alaya vijnana. Although these two cardinal Mahayana doctrines seem to have originated independently, and their relationship can be described as being diametrical, they were nevertheless combined together into a unified doctrinal framework in the Awakening of Faith, the text that forms the basis for Tsung-Mi's theory of sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation. In order to understand why this text was of such importance for Tsung-Mi, we must first consider these two different conceptions of the mind separately. As is generally acknowledged by modern Buddhologists, the Tathagata-garbha doctrine can ultimately be traced back to the early pre-Mahayana teaching of an innately pure, luminous mind, prabhasvara citta, which is only adventitiously covered over by defilements, agantuka klesha. The term Tathagata-garbha means both the embryo and the womb of the Tathagata. The first sense of the term emphasizing the potentiality for Buddhahood, which exists embryonically within all sentient beings, while the second emphasizes the fact that the pure Dharmakaya lies hidden within the defiled condition. The implication of this doctrine, as it was elaborated in Tathagata-garbha texts such as the Tathagata-garbha and Srimala scriptures and the Ratnagotra Vibhaga, is that enlightenment is the natural and true state of the mind. The basis for enlightenment thus exists within the mind of all sentient beings. This means that enlightenment does not represent an overcoming of or triumph over the mind so much as a realization of its own inherent potential. Whereas the Tathagata-garbha doctrine provides an answer to the question of how enlightenment is possible, it does so by sidestepping the equally vexing problem of the origin of ignorance. That is, if the fundamental nature of the mind is intrinsically pure, i.e. enlightened, how or from where do the impurities that obscure it, i.e. ignorance, arise? If they arise from the mind itself, how can the nature of the mind be considered intrinsically pure? If, on the other hand, they arise from somewhere outside the mind, then how can the mind be considered the fundamental ground of both samsara and nirvana? Moreover, if we posit a separate origin for ignorance, or the impurities that would lead to the untoward consequence of a dualism in which enlightenment and ignorance function together as ontological principles in the soteriological drama of samsara and nirvana. The particular weakness of Tathagata-garbha thought, its shunting of the problem of the origin of ignorance, is systematically dealt with in the Yogacara analysis of the mind and mental processes. Here the Alaya Vijnana is posited as the repository or seedbed out of which impurities arise, and the impure seeds from which they originate are said to exist innately within the Alaya Vijnana ab aeterno. Furthermore, the impurities that are manifested from out of the Alaya Vijnana in turn condition the Alaya Vijnana, forming new seeds from which further impurities are generated. Thus, according to the Yogacara analysis, the Alaya Vijnana is the source and support of all impure dharmas. Whence then do pure dharmas, those which have the power to reverse the self-perpetuating process of conditioning by which impure dharmas are produced, arise? According to the Mahayana Sangraha, She Ta Sheng Lun, one of the principal texts regarded as authoritative for the Yogacara tradition, the supramundane pure mind is born from seeds sown by the correct hearing of the Dharma. In other words, the process by which the mind becomes purified has its inception outside the mind. The mind does not contain the seeds of its own transformation. These, rather, are extrinsic to it. Enlightenment is thus characterized as a revolution of the support, Chua-ni, Ashraya Paravriti. The nature of the mind must undergo a fundamental and radical transformation before enlightenment can take place, and the mind of one who has undergone such a transformation can no longer be spoken of as the Alaya Vijnana. It must be referred to as the Amala Vijnana, Amoloshi, or undefiled consciousness instead. Hence, although the Yogacara tradition can be seen as giving a successful and cogent account of the origin of ignorance in its doctrine of the Alaya Vijnana and the process of mental conditioning, Vasana, it does so by making the basis of enlightenment extraneous to the mind, thus implying that enlightenment is fortuitous. The fact that the Tathagata-garbha and Alaya Vijnana doctrines can be seen as complementing one another in such a way that each compensates for the shortcoming of the other made some kind of synthesis of the two inevitable, as seems to have happened for the first time with the Lankavatara Sutra. This synthesis was carried further and pursued more systematically in the Awakening of Faith. This work, whose provenance is still controversial, seems to have been composed in China sometime during the third quarter of the 6th century. It defines the Tathagata-garbha as the absolute mind of suchness, Chenju Ishin, which it analyzes as having two aspects, the absolute, Pupian, which it refers to as the mind as suchness, Shin Chenju, and the conditioned, Sui Yuan, which it refers to as the mind that is subject to birth and death, Shin Sheng Mie. The first aspect corresponds to the Tathagata-garbha as it truly is, that is, the Dharmakaya, while the second aspect corresponds to the Tathagata-garbha as the Dharmakaya covered over by defilements. Moreover, the conditioned aspect of the Tathagata-garbha, the mind that is subject to birth and death, is identified with the Alaya Vijnana, which is defined as the interfusion of that which is not subject to birth and death with that which is subject to birth and death in such a way that they are neither one nor different. Because the Alaya Vijnana is defined as the point where these two aspects of the mind interact, it thus functions as the dynamic factor in the equation of mind by containing within itself the potential for both enlightenment, Chue, and non-enlightenment, Pu-chue. 4. Tsung-Mi's analysis of mind. As graphically illustrated in the diagram that occurs at the end of the Chan preface, both the process of delusion and that of enlightenment are based on the dynamic ambivalence of the Alaya Vijnana, which contains both an enlightened and an unenlightened aspect. Tsung-Mi furthermore breaks down both of these processes into 10 symmetrical stages, which can best be represented by reproducing the relevant portion of his diagram. Tsung-Mi's diagram of the process of enlightenment and delusion. At the top of the diagram, Alaya Vijnana. The diagram branches off into enlightened aspect and unenlightened aspect. Under enlightened aspect, we see 1. Sudden enlightenment. 10. Attainment of Buddhahood. 9. Free from thoughts. 8. Mastery of mind. 7. Mastery of forms. 6. Emptiness of things. 5. Emptiness of self. 4. Spiritual development. 3. Cultivation of 5 practices. 2. Resolving to attain enlightenment. And under unenlightened aspect, we have, again descending, 1. Intrinsic enlightenment. 2. Unenlightenment. 3. Arising of thoughts. 4. Arising of perceiving subject. 5. Manifestation of perceived objects. 6. Attachment to things. 7. Attachment to self. 8. Defilements. 9. Generating karma. 10. Experiencing the consequences. The 10 stages in the genesis and development of delusion answer the question of how sentient beings come to assume a human form. Basing his theory on the awakening of faith, Tsung-Mi gives an account of how this process begins in his inquiry into the origin of man. At first there is only the one true numinous nature, Yi Chen Ling Xing, which is neither born nor destroyed, neither increases nor decreases, and neither changes nor alters. Nevertheless, sentient beings are from time without beginning asleep, in delusion, and not themselves aware of it. Because it is covered over, it is called the Tathagata-garbha, and the phenomenal appearance of the mind that is subject to birth and death comes into existence based on the Tathagata-garbha. The interfusion of the true mind that is not subject to birth and death, and deluded thoughts that are subject to birth and death in such a way that they are neither one nor different, is referred to as the Alaya Vijnana. This consciousness has the 2 modes of enlightenment and unenlightenment. The etiology of delusion, as it is schematically laid out in the Chan preface, can be outlined as follows. 1. Intrinsic enlightenment. This is the ontological ground from which the process evolves. The awakening of faith defines intrinsic enlightenment as follows. Enlightenment means that the essence of the mind is free from thoughts. The characteristic of being free from thoughts is like the realm of empty space that pervades everywhere. As the single characteristic of the Dharmadhatu, it is the undifferentiated Dharmakaya of the Tathagata. Since it is based on the Dharmakaya, when it is spoken of, it is referred to as intrinsic enlightenment. Tsung-Mi compares intrinsic enlightenment to a wealthy and respected man, upright and wise, living in his own home. 2. Unenlightenment, pu-chieh. This refers to the unenlightened aspect of the Alaya Vijnana. Tsung-Mi compares it to the wealthy and respected man falling asleep and forgetting who he is. The metaphor of delusion as a state of being asleep is naturally suggested by the term for enlightenment, chieh, which literally means to awaken. This stage is what, in other contexts, Tsung-Mi refers to as primordial ignorance, Kenpen Wu Ming, or autonomous ignorance, Tuto Wu Ming. It is the root, pen, of the remaining stages in the process of the evolution of delusion, which accordingly are its branches, mo. 3. Arising of thought, nian-chi. This is the first subtle movement of thought, which initiates the process of phenomenal evolution by giving rise to the bifurcation of consciousness into subject and object. It corresponds to the first of the 3 subtle phenomenal appearances, san, shi, xiang, enumerated in the awakening of faith, that of activity, ye, or, more fully, the activity of ignorance, wu ming ye. Tsung-Mi compares it to the dreams that naturally arise in the mind of the sleeping man. 4. Arising of the perceiving subject, jian-chi. This corresponds to the second subtle phenomenal appearance of the awakening of faith, that of perceiving subject, neng-jian. Tsung-Mi compares it to the dreaming consciousness. 5. Manifestation of perceived objects, jing-chi. This refers to the manifestation of the body of the senses and the receptacle world. It corresponds to the third subtle phenomenal appearance of the awakening of faith, that of objects of perception, jing-chieh. Tsung-Mi compares it to the wealthy and respected man who, within his dream, sees himself dwelling in squalor and misery and perceives things that he likes and dislikes. 6. Attachment to things, fa-chi. This corresponds to the first and second of the 6 coarse phenomenal appearances, liu, tzu, xiang, enumerated in the awakening of faith, those of discrimination, shih-chieh, and continuation, xiang-shi. Tsung-Mi compares this stage to the man clinging to the things that he sees in his dream as real. 7. Attachment to self, wo-chi. This corresponds to the third and fourth coarse phenomenal appearances in the awakening of faith, that of attachment, chi-chi, and symbolic representation, ji-ming-tzu. Tsung-Mi compares it to the man identifying himself with the person in the dream. 8. Defilements, fan-nao. This refers to the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and folly. Tsung-Mi compares it to the man hankering after those things in the dream that accord with his feelings and forming an aversion to those things in the dream that go against his feelings. 9. Generating karma, cao-ye. This corresponds to the 5th coarse phenomenal appearance in the awakening of faith, that of giving rise to karma, chi-ye. The dreaming man commits various good and bad deeds on the basis of his likes and dislikes. 10. Experiencing the consequences, shou-pao. This corresponds to the 6th coarse phenomenal appearance in the awakening of faith, that of the suffering connected with karma, ye-shi-ku. The dreaming man thus experiences various good and bad consequences. The 10 stages in the process of phenomenal evolution function in the same way as the classical 12-linked chain of conditioned origination, pratitya samutpada. According to Ashvaghosha's account of the Buddha's enlightenment in the Buddhacharita, for example, it was by understanding the chain of conditions upon which the whole mass of suffering attendant upon the cycle of birth and death depended, that the Buddha was thereby able to reverse the process by successively eliminating each stage. The 10 stages of phenomenal evolution that Tsung-Mi enumerates in the Chan Preface likewise serve as a map for liberation. Accordingly, each stage in the process of enlightenment counteracts, fan, the corresponding stage in the process of delusion. 1. Sudden enlightenment, donwu. In this stage, one meets a good friend, kalyanamitra, whose guidance enables him to gain an insight into the intrinsically enlightened true nature of the mind. This stage counteracts the 2nd stage in the process of delusion, that of unenlightenment. 2. Resolving to attain enlightenment, fa-xin. In this stage, one generates compassion, wisdom, and vows, resolving to attain supreme enlightenment. This stage counteracts the 10th stage in the process of delusion, that of experiencing the consequences of one's actions, according to which one is born in one of the 6 destinies. 3. Cultivating the 5 practices, xiu wu xing. In this stage, one cultivates giving, dana, morality, shila, patience, kshanti, striving, virya, and meditative insight, shamatha vipassana. These are the 5 practices enumerated in the awakening of faith, according to which the 5th and 6th perfections, paramita, those of dhyana and prajna, in the standard scheme of 6 perfections have been collapsed into one, that of meditative insight. The 5th practice, however, consists of 2 elements, corresponding to dhyana and prajna, which are subsequently treated separately in the awakening of faith. This stage counteracts the 9th stage in the process of delusion, that of generating karma. 4. Spiritual development, kai-fa. This stage entails the development of the compassion, wisdom, and vows previously generated in the 2nd stage and counteracts the 8th stage in the process of delusion, that of defilements. 5. Emptiness of self, wo-kung. In this stage, one realizes that there is no substantially existing autonomous self. This stage counteracts the 9th stage in the process of delusion, that of attachment to self. 6. Emptiness of things, fa-kung. In this stage, one realizes that all things are devoid of a self-nature. This stage counteracts the 6th stage in the process of delusion, that of attachment to things. 7. Mastery of form, se-tzu-tsai. Having realized that the objects of perception are nothing but manifestations of one's own mind, one gains mastery over them in this stage. This stage counteracts the 5th stage in the process of delusion, that of the manifestation of perceived objects. 8. Mastery of mind, shin-tzu-tsai. In this stage, one gains mastery over the perceiving subject. This stage counteracts the 4th stage in the process of delusion, that of the arising of the perceiving subject. 9. Freedom from thought, li-nian. In this stage, one becomes fully aware of the ultimate origin of deluded thoughts and sees that the true nature of the mind is eternal. This is the stage of ultimate awakening, Chengguan, described in the awakening of faith, and counteracts the 3rd stage in the process of delusion, that of the arising of thoughts. 10. Attainment of Buddhahood, Zhengfo. In this stage, one returns to the ultimate source of the mind, realizing that, since the mind is of its very essence free from thoughts, there is ultimately no distinction between the various stages in the process of the realization of enlightenment. all of which were from the very beginning undifferentiated and identical with intrinsic enlightenment, which is one and indivisible. When this process of the realization of enlightenment is completed and one has attained Buddhahood, it is seen that the genesis and unfolding of delusion and the realization of enlightenment are not two separate, parallel, linear processes moving in opposite directions. Rather, one realizes that the two form a continuum. The final stage in the process of enlightenment brings one back to the fundamental basis from which the process of delusion unfolded. The process taken as a whole thus forms a circle in which intrinsic enlightenment would be represented by 0 degrees and attainment of Buddhahood by 360 degrees. The circularity of the process is symbolized by the circles that correspond to each stage, the relative degree of enlightenment and delusion of which is represented by the relative degree of white and black, suggesting that the phases of delusion and enlightenment evolve and change like the waxing and waning of the moon. The points between 0 and 180 degrees, that is, the 9 stages in the process of the unfolding of delusion, beginning with unenlightenment and ending with experiencing the consequences, all involve a movement away from enlightenment, what Tsung-Mi refers to as the process of conforming to the flow of birth and death, shun anuloma. It is during this phase of the process that one gains a human body, and because of good karma generated in previous existences, finally comes to the turning point in the process, located at 180 degrees, when one meets a good friend whose guidance enables one to gain a sudden insight into one's true nature. This is what Tsung-Mi refers to as sudden enlightenment, i.e. jie-wu, an experience that reverses the direction of one's karma, what Tsung-Mi refers to as the process of going against the flow of birth and death, ni pratiloma, and begins one's return back to one's original enlightened nature. The 8 stages in the process of the realization of enlightenment, that is, those beginning with resolving to attain enlightenment and ending with freedom from thoughts, describe the process of gradual cultivation, or what the awakening of faith refers to as shih-chieh. With the attainment of Buddhahood, i.e. Chengguan, one returns to the ultimate point of origin. Beginning and end are one. The circle is completed, and the process is brought to its natural conclusion. Tsung-Mi's diagram can thus be rearranged in the form of a circle. The diagram rearrangement of Tsung-Mi's diagram in the form of a circle. At the top of the circle, intrinsic enlightenment, and going clockwise, unenlightenment, arising of thoughts, arising of perceiving subject, manifestation of perceived objects, attachment to things, attachment to self, defilements, generating karma, experiencing the consequences, sudden enlightenment, resolving to attain enlightenment, cultivation of 5 practices, spiritual development, emptiness of self, emptiness of things, mastery of forms, mastery of mind, free from thoughts, attainment of enlightenment, and then back round again into intrinsic enlightenment. Moreover, when one has attained Buddhahood, one realizes that all the stages in the process are equally nothing but a manifestation of the absolute mind, Yi Shin, whose fundamental nature is eternally pure and enlightened and can never be tainted by the defilements that appear to obscure it. The defilements are accidental, being only the result of sentient beings' delusion. But the true nature of reality is unaffected by the failure of sentient beings to see it as it really is. Thus, even though the Tathagata appears to be defiled, it is forever immaculate and inviolate. When one attains enlightenment, one realizes that intrinsic enlightenment is more than a stage in the process of delusion and enlightenment. It is also the fundamental ground upon which the entire process is based. The pen, in the term pen-chieh, thus indicates that intrinsic enlightenment is not only ontologically prior to the other phases of the process, which are only epiphenomena, mo or xiang, but that it is also the ontological ground, pen or sheng, that underlies all of them equally. The relationship between intrinsic enlightenment and the other phases of the process of delusion and enlightenment can best be illustrated by making use of Tsung-Mi's adaptation of the famous metaphor of water and waves from the awakening of faith. The originally tranquil surface of the water in which all things are reflected clearly, intrinsic enlightenment, becomes stirred up by the action of the wind of ignorance, unenlightenment, to form waves, i.e. the process of delusion. Even though the wind ceases suddenly, sudden enlightenment, jie-wu, the motion of the waves only subsides gradually, i.e. the process of the realization of enlightenment, gradual cultivation, shih-chieh, until all movement has stopped and the surface of the water is once again tranquil, attainment of Buddhahood, Chengguan. Nevertheless, whether the surface of the water is tranquil or agitated, whether its waves are large or small, it is all equally water, i.e. the absolute mind. Moreover, the changing condition of the surface of the water does not affect its fundamental nature of being able to reflect all things, intrinsic enlightenment. 5. Tsung-Mi's criticism of the northern and Hongzhou lines. In order to assess Tsung-Mi's position with respect to the larger historical context of the sudden gradual polarity, it is first necessary to analyze his criticisms of some of the other Chan approaches to religious cultivation. As his criticisms of these other approaches turn on his understanding of the fundamental nature of mind, the analysis will further clarify the deep structure of his thought, as well as highlight what was at stake for him in his characterization of the Hozi teaching as sudden enlightenment, followed by gradual cultivation. The two Chan traditions whose critiques are most pertinent in this regard are the northern and Hongzhou lineages. A. Tsung-Mi's critique of the northern line. Within his scheme of the various permutations of the terms sudden and gradual as they apply to enlightenment and cultivation, Tsung-Mi identifies the teaching and practice of the northern line as falling under the category of gradual cultivation, followed by sudden enlightenment. In both his subcommentary to his commentary and his abridged commentary to the Scripture of Perfect Enlightenment, Yuan Jue, Jing Ta Shu Zhao, and Luwei Shu Zhao, he points out that this case can be interpreted in two ways. The first presumes a prior sudden insight, i.e., Jie Wu, thus conforming to his threefold model of religious practice, and so differing only in emphasis, but not substance, from the case of sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation, which presumes a subsequent realization of enlightenment, Chengwu, as its unstated third term. The second interpretation of gradual cultivation followed by sudden enlightenment does not presume a prior experience of insight, and it is within this framework that Tsung-Mi places and criticizes Northern Chan. Tsung-Mi's clearest criticism of Northern Chan occurs in his Chan chart, where he gives the following characterization of its major tenets. Sentient beings originally have an enlightened nature, just as a mirror has a luminous nature, but defilements cover it from view, just as a mirror is darkened by dust. If we rely on the teachings of a master and extinguish our deluded thoughts, then when those thoughts are eliminated, the nature of the mind will be enlightened, and there will be nothing that is not known. It is like wiping away dust. When the dust is eliminated, the essence of the mirror is luminous and clear, and there is nothing that is not reflected in it. Therefore, the founder of this lineage, Shen Shu, presented the following verse to the fifth patriarch. The body is the Bodhi tree. The mind is like a luminous mirror. We must always wipe it clean, and never let dust collect. Tsung-Mi then goes on to give the following critique. This teaching merely consists in the method of going against the flow of birth and death and opposing residual conditioning, shi, vasana, based on the phenomenal appearances of impure and pure conditioned origination, Zhangjing, Yuanqi, Qi Xiang, and has not yet awakened to the fact that deluded thoughts are intrinsically empty and that the nature of the mind is intrinsically pure. When enlightenment is not yet deeply penetrated, how can cultivation be in conformity with the true? Tsung-Mi's characterization of Northern Chan emphasizes the importance of the Tathagatagarbha, the intrinsically enlightened nature possessed by all sentient beings. His criticism also shows that he sees its understanding of the Tathagatagarbha as being different from his own in a profoundly significant way. In order to see precisely wherein this difference lies and what it means for Tsung-Mi, it is necessary to place Tsung-Mi's critique of Northern Chan into the larger doctrinal context that he articulates in his Chan Preface, where he identifies its teaching with that of the Fa Xiang brand of Yogacara. Tsung-Mi's major critique of Fa Xiang is that there is an unbridgeable gap between the Alaya Vijnana and suchness, Zhenju, ta-ta-ta. He charges that in the Fa Xiang teaching, dharmas subject to birth and death are not connected with suchness, Shengmie, Teng Fa, Pu Quan, Zhenju. In terms of the two aspects of the mind outlined in the Awakening of Faith, this means that there is no connection between the mind as suchness, Xin Zhenju, and the mind that is subject to birth and death, Xin Shengmie. In other words, there is no connection between the Tathagatagarbha and Alaya Vijnana. Suchness is seen to be static, Ningzhan, inert, and Pupian, unchanging. That is, not involved in the production of pure and impure phenomenal appearances, Xiang. Where the Fa Xiang teaching falls short is in its recognition of only one aspect of the absolute mind, Yi Xin. While it acknowledges its unchanging, Pupian, character, it wholly ignores its conditioned, Sui Yuan, character. In other words, it does not realize that the phenomenal appearances it purports to analyze are the functioning, Yong, of the mind, as suchness, as it accords with conditions, Sui Yuan. But it is precisely the conditioned aspect of suchness that is of vital importance for Tsung-Mi, because it links the Tathagatagarbha with the Alaya Vijnana, and thereby accounts for how suchness accords with conditions to form all pure and impure states. It is this conditioned aspect of suchness that Tsung-Mi refers to as nature origination, Shih-chieh, a term that emphasizes the dynamic quality of his understanding of the fundamental nature of the mind. In Tsung-Mi's view, it is because the Fa-Qiang teaching lacks the principle of nature origination that there is nothing to mediate between the Alaya Vijnana and suchness, the realm of defiled activity, and that of unconditioned purity. It is thus guilty of a fundamental dualism. Nature origination, on the other hand, bridges this gap by affirming that all phenomenal appearances, xiang, are nothing but a manifestation, yong, of the nature, xing, that is their very essence, di. Nature origination overcomes this dualism by making use of the paradigm of essence and function, di yong. This conceptual paradigm, which had played a dominant role in Chinese metaphysical vocabulary since at least the Neo-Taoist speculations of the 3rd century, provides the basic conceptual framework in terms of which Tsung-Mi structures his thought. The various polarities that Tsung-Mi employs, such as nature and phenomenal appearances, or root, pen, and branch, mo, all conform to this paradigm. Essence, nature, and root on the one hand, and function, phenomenal appearances, and branch on the other, are all interchangeable. The equation of the essence and function paradigm with that of root and branch also reveals toward which side the polarity is weighted in value. Tsung-Mi's criticism of Fa-Qiang applies to Northern Chan as well, whose practice is directed toward removing the impurities that obscure the intrinsic purity of the mind. Such a practice is based on a fundamental misconception because it does not realize that the impurities themselves are empty, kung, shunya. And by empty, Tsung-Mi means that they lack any independent reality of their own, because they are nothing but a manifestation of the intrinsically pure mind, as it accords with conditions. The impurities are thus not impure in themselves. Rather, their impurity lies in the dualistic misapprehension of them as impure. In other words, the failure to see through them to the intrinsically pure nature that is their essence, and of which they are an expression. This dualism, or fundamental misconception, which Tsung-Mi sees as informing Northern Chan teaching, is based on the absence of jie-wu, the initial sudden experience of insight. Such an insight consists in recognizing the fundamental identity of sentient beings and Buddhas, samsara and nirvana. Hence it also entails the recognition that deluded thoughts, i.e. dust, lack any reality of their own, wang nian pen wu, because they are merely the functioning of the essence of the mind as it accords with conditions. In other words, jie wu is an insight into nature origination as the fundamental unifying principle behind the apparent multiplicity of phenomenal appearances. This insight validates the mundane world of phenomenal appearances as the manifestation of our nature. Phenomenal appearances are therefore empty, and so are not really impure. Tsung-Mi's most comprehensive discussion of nature origination occurs in a passage in his subcommentary to Chengguan's commentary to the chapter on the practice and vows of Samantabhadra from Prajna's translation of the Gandavyuha. There he connects it to conditioned origination, yuan-chi, pratitya samutpada, and shows how it is related to the processes of delusion and enlightenment. Nature origination and conditioned origination present two different causal models offering different levels of explanation. Conditioned origination explains how different phenomenal appearances condition one another, while nature origination explains how all phenomenal appearances are ultimately based upon the nature. In his discussion of conditioned origination, Tsung-Mi first distinguishes between two modes, what he calls defiled conditioned origination, Zhan Yuan-Ji, and pure conditioned origination, Jing Yuan-Ji. These two modes correspond to the parallel processes of delusion and enlightenment discussed above. He then goes on to make further crucial distinction between two different levels of defiled conditioning, which he refers to as 1, its beginningless root, wuxi ken-pen, and 2, its evolved branches, zhanchuan, qi-mo. The first refers to autonomous ignorance, tu-to, wu-ming, variants tu-xing wu-ming, pu-kung wu-ming, avidya, aviniki, or what he later refers to as primordial ignorance, ken-pen wu-ming. This is an ignorance that exists prior to, at least logically, if not also temporally, and independently of the defilements, klesha. It is the root of the later evolved branches, i.e. the last 8 stages in the process of delusion. Sudden enlightenment, jie-wu, counteracts this primordial ignorance. Once the process of delusion has been set in motion, however, it becomes self-perpetuating. Gradual cultivation is therefore necessary to counteract its evolved branches. Since according to Tsung-Mi's analysis, the northern line lacks sudden enlightenment, jie-wu, its gradual cultivation is qualitatively different from the gradual cultivation that follows jie-wu. Nature is not only the basis of phenomenal appearances, but also the ground of practice. This failure to recognize the essential nature of all phenomenal appearances is implicit in Tsung-Mi's charge that the practice taught by Northern Chan is inauthentic, fei chen, As Tsung-Mi adds in his account of this teaching in his subcommentary to the Scripture of Perfect Enlightenment, if cultivation is not in conformity with the true, how can one attain realization even after many kalpas? Thus, when Tsung-Mi says that Northern Chan merely consists in the method of going against the flow and opposing residual conditioning based on the phenomenal appearances of impure and pure conditioned origination, he is implicitly criticizing it for not understanding nature origination. B. Tsung-Mi's critique of the Hongzhou line. Tsung-Mi characterizes the teaching of the Hongzhou line as being diametrically opposed to that of the Northern line. He contrasts the two by remarking that the Northern line regards everything as altogether false, Wang, whereas the Hongzhou line regards everything as altogether true, Chen. Their approaches to cultivation are accordingly opposite. The Northern line advocates subjugating the mind so as to extinguish the false, Fu Xin Mie Wang, whereas the Hongzhou line advocates entrusting oneself to act freely according to the nature of one's feelings, Xin Zhen Cheng Xing. Where the Northern line falls into dualism, the position of the Hongzhou line leads to a radical non-dualism by collapsing essence, Ti, into function, Yong. Tsung-Mi characterizes its stance in the Chan chart. The arising of mental activity, the movement of thought, even snapping the fingers or moving the eyes, all actions and activities are the functioning of the entire essence of the Buddha nature. Since there is no other kind of functioning, greed, anger, and folly, the performance of good and bad actions, and the experiencing of their pleasurable and painful consequences are all in their entirety Buddha nature. Because all activities, whether good or bad, enlightened or deluded, are the functioning of the entire essence of the Buddha nature, there is no essence outside of its functioning. If one examines the nature of its essence thoroughly, one will see that ultimately it can neither be perceived nor be realized, just as the eye cannot see itself, and so on. If one considers its responsive functioning, one will see that everything that one does is the Buddha nature, and that there is nothing else that can either realize it or be realized. The ethically dangerous implication of this teaching for Tsung-Mi is that if the essence can only be perceived through its functioning, and moreover everything is equally the functioning of the essence in its entirety, then the essence becomes totally eclipsed by its functioning. Tsung-Mi, however, insists that while the essence and its functioning are different aspects of the same reality, they are nevertheless still different, and that their difference is important because the essence, as what is most fundamental, pen, is the source of value. His assimilation of the essence function, Di Yong, paradigm, into that of root and branch, pen mo, entails a notion of religious practice as a return to a more basic state, the primordial condition of the mind before its bifurcation into subject and object, attendant upon the first subtle movement of thought. It is only through a direct experience of the essence that its functioning can be validated as true. It is because the Hongzhou line collapses essence into function that Tsung-Mi regards its attitude towards cultivation as antinomian. He holds that its proponents maintain that one should neither rouse the mind to cut off evil nor cultivate the way. Since the way itself is the mind, one cannot use the mind to cultivate the mind. Since evil is also the mind, one cannot use the mind to cut off the mind. One who neither cuts off evil nor does good but freely accepts things as they are is called a liberated person. There is no dharma that can be clung to or any Buddhahood that can be attained. Simply allowing the mind to act spontaneously is cultivation. Although on one level Tsung-Mi would not gainsay the Hongzhou assertion that ultimately there is no Buddhahood to attain, he would also insist that that realization is precisely what Buddhahood consists in, and that such a statement can only be meaningfully made from the standpoint of one who has attained Buddhahood. It would be a grave error for one who has not yet attained that state to conclude facilely that there is, therefore, no reason to cultivate Buddhahood. Tsung-Mi insists that while ultimately the nature transcends all dualistic categories, yet there is still a difference between enlightenment and delusion as far as sentient beings are concerned. And it is the tension created by the difference between enlightenment and delusion that vivifies practice. Hongzhou constantly says, since greed, anger, compassion, and good deeds are all the Buddha nature, how can there be any difference between them? This is like someone who sees that there is never any difference in the wetness of the water, not realizing that there is an enormous difference between the success of a boat that crosses over it and the failure of a boat that capsizes in it. Therefore, as far as this line's approach towards sudden enlightenment is concerned, even though it comes close, it still does not hit the mark, and as far as its approach toward gradual cultivation is concerned, it is mistaken and completely backwards. Tsung-Mi's criticism of the Hongzhou line reveals that his use of the essence-function paradigm is more complex than might at first be apparent. while he emphasizes the inseparability of essence and function as different aspects of the same reality, he also stresses their difference. They are neither one nor different, pui pui, just as the true mind, that is not subject to birth and death, interfuses with deluded thoughts in such a way that they are neither one nor different. Their inseparability is what makes religious cultivation possible, and their difference is what makes religious cultivation necessary. Tsung-Mi thus uses the essence-function paradigm to preserve an ethically critical duality within a larger ontological unity. While this paradigm overcomes the dualism of Northern Chan on the one hand, it also serves to avoid the radical non-dualism of Hongzhou on the other. As part of his criticism of the Hongzhou line, Tsung-Mi uses the analogy of a bronze mirror to illustrate the difference between its teaching and that of his own Hotze line. He does so by introducing a critical distinction between two levels of functioning, what he calls the intrinsic functioning of the self-nature, zuxing penyong, and its responsive functioning in accord with conditions, sui yuan ying yong. The material substance of the bronze mirror is the essence of self-nature. The luminous reflectivity, Ming, of the bronze is the functioning of the self-nature, and the images reflected by its luminous reflectivity are its functioning in accord with conditions. The images are reflected in direct response to conditions. While the reflections may have thousands of variations, the luminous reflectivity is the ever-present luminous reflectivity of the self-nature. The functioning of self-nature is synonymous with intrinsic enlightenment. The functioning in accord with conditions refers to the psychophysical functions of speech, discrimination, bodily movement, and the like. The relationship between these two orders of functioning can be characterized in terms of the essence and function, or root and branch, paradigm. The functioning of the self-nature is the essence or root of the functioning in accord with conditions. Tsung-Mi uses this distinction to point out that the Hongzhou line, in overemphasizing the responsive functioning of the Buddha nature, altogether misses the functioning of its self-nature. Its practice, therefore, lacks ontological grounding and is apt to veer off in ethically dangerous directions. By making this distinction crucial for differentiating between the Hongzhou and Hotze teachings, Tsung-Mi reaffirms his emphasis on essence in contradistinction to function. By calling attention to the importance of the intrinsic functioning of the self-nature, Tsung-Mi effectively drives a wedge between essence and function to ensure that they cannot be collapsed in the way he understands the Hongzhou teaching to have done. 6. Tsung-Mi's theory and Shenhui. Tsung-Mi's characteristic tendency to find the most comprehensive framework into which all other perspectives can be subsumed must be taken into consideration when evaluating his accounts of the various Chan traditions. That is to say, his characterizations are schematic rather than descriptive. Locating a tradition within a larger conceptual scheme often seems to be more important than giving a textured description of it. And that larger conceptual scheme is the particular vision of Huayan teaching that Tsung-Mi espoused and identified with the teaching of Hotze Shenhui. It could be objected that his identification of the teaching of the northern line of Chan with that of Fa Shang, for example, is reductive and forces the complexity of its teaching into a prefabricated mold, equipped with its own built-in doctrinal critique. All the same, Tsung-Mi was thoroughly acquainted with much of the Chan literature of his time, having devoted himself to collecting the extant writings of the various Chan traditions into a separate basket, Pitaka, to which his Chan preface was to serve as a general introduction. His opinions on the various traditions were thus based on a broad knowledge of their teachings, and therefore merit our careful attention. Nevertheless, we must also bear in mind that his understanding and portrayal of them were framed by his own doctrinal orientation, which in turn was shaped by his reaction to the more radical interpretations of Chan practice that he encountered during his formative period of Chan training in Sichuan. As Yanagida Seizan has shown, the most extreme of these, the Pao Tang, had extended Shenhui's teaching of no-thought, Wunyan, to entail a rejection of all forms of traditional Buddhist ethical practice and ritual observance. Tsung-Mi's reaction against radical forms of Chan, seen in his critique of the Hongzhou line, calls into question the degree to which his teachings authentically represent those of Shenhui. Evidence can be found in the extant fragments of Shenhui's teachings to support Tsung-Mi's claim that his position can be characterized as advocating sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation. As we have seen, one of the analogies that Tsung-Mi uses to illustrate this position is that of an infant who possesses all of its limbs and faculties intact the moment it is born, but only learns to master their use gradually. This analogy was very likely drawn from Shenhui, as the following passage from his recorded sayings suggests. Each one of the great masters of my lineage for the last 6 generations spoke of piercing through the heart of the matter, with a single thrust of the sword, Tan Tao Qi Zhu, and directly seeing the nature, Qi Liao Jian Xing. They didn't say anything about a gradual progression, Jiai Jian. Followers of the way, you should suddenly see your Buddha nature, Tun Qian Fo Xing, and then gradually cultivate causal conditions, Qian Shu Yin Yuan. It is like a mother suddenly giving birth to a child, giving him her breast, and gradually nurturing and rearing him. Suddenly awakening and seeing one's Buddha nature, Dun Wu Qian Fo Xing, is also like this. Wisdom naturally increases gradually. Qi Hui Zu Zhan Jian Jian Zeng Zhang. Yet Tsung-Mi also uses an analogy from Shenhui to illustrate sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation, the position in which obstructions are suddenly cut off, just as myriad strands of silk are severed with a single stroke when cutting a piece of silk cloth. Compare Tsung-Mi's use of this analogy with the following passage from Shenhui's recorded sayings. Wu Xing further asked, if the defilements are so innumerable and limitless that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas pass through eons and still have not been able to succeed in eliminating them, how could the dragon girl in the story from the Lotus Sutra have been able to give rise to her aspiration for enlightenment in an instant, Cha Na Fa Xin, and immediately have attained true enlightenment, Bian Zheng Zheng Chui? The Ho Shang, Shen Hui, replied, raising the aspiration for enlightenment can be either sudden or gradual, Fa Xin Yu Tun Qian, and delusion in enlightenment can be either slow or quick, Mi Wu Yu Qi Qi. Delusion lasts for repeated eons, Mi Qi Le Qie, but enlightenment takes place instantaneously, Wu Qi Xiu Yu. For example, even though the number of strands in a roll of silk is incalculable, if one gathers them together into a rope, puts them on a board, and severs them with a sharp sword, then at once they will all be cut in two. Although the strands are numerous, they do not take more than a single stroke of a sword. A person who gives rise to the aspiration for enlightenment is also like this. If he meets a true, good friend who skillfully uses expedients to reveal suchness directly, then with his diamond-like wisdom he will cut through the defilements belonging to the various stages of the bodhisattva, be immediately enlightened, Huo Jian, Xiao Wu, and see for himself that the nature of reality, Fa Xing, is originally empty and tranquil. His wisdom will then be sharp, bright, and clear, and will penetrate everywhere without obstruction. When he realizes this, his myriad karmic conditions will be simultaneously severed, and his deluded thoughts, which are more numerous than the sands of the Ganges, will be suddenly done away with all at once. The limitless excellent virtues of a Buddha will be fully ready to be used according to circumstances. As already noted, Tsung-Mi also quotes twice from Shen Hui in his explanation of the case of sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation in the Chan Preface. The fact that Tsung-Mi can draw from Shen Hui to illustrate two contrasting positions suggests, at the very least, that there are divergent tendencies intermixed within Shen Hui's thought. However we assess Shen Hui as a personality, he was certainly not a systematic thinker. Whatever his motivation, he seems to have put forward different positions in response to different questions, and never seems to have felt the need to integrate them into a comprehensive doctrinal framework. The position that Tsung-Mi upholds as the orthodox one, that of sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation, could be characterized as conservative in contrast to that of sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation, which could accordingly be characterized as radical. While we can find evidence for both positions within the Shen Hui fragments, that of sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation generally seems to be a fallback position to which Shen Hui retreats under the brunt of a certain line of questioning. It does not seem to be the position that he puts forward as his own when he is on the offensive. In any case, Tsung-Mi, in his characterization of Shen Hui's teaching, seems to have identified the more conservative strand of his thought as orthodox and suppressed the more radical one. That is, he plays down the strong prajna paramita thrust in Shen Hui's teaching while emphasizing a Yogacara understanding of the obduracy of the defilements. This emphasis no doubt reflects Tsung-Mi's reaction to the radical way Shen Hui's teaching had been adapted by some of the Szechuan Chan traditions. 7. Conclusion. Tsung-Mi's analysis of the different contexts in which the terms sudden, dun, and gradual, jian, operate does much to make sense out of what often seems to be a hopelessly confused and confusing issue. For this reason alone, it is worth our attention. Yet, ironically, it is just its ability to render the tangle of controversy intelligible that, in the final analysis, betrays Tsung-Mi as a gradualist. His approach to the sudden gradual issue is fully congruent with his approach to Buddhist doctrine. That is, he tries to reconcile conflicting interpretations by uncovering a more comprehensive framework in which they can all be harmoniously sublated. His theory of sudden enlightenment followed by gradual cultivation integrates the experience of sudden enlightenment into a comprehensive vision of a progressive path of spiritual cultivation, one that emphasizes the importance of a sudden leap of insight within a larger philosophy of progress. By so doing, Tsung-Mi, in effect, domesticates the experience of enlightenment. But this is precisely what the subitist claims can never be done, for there is a profound sense in which enlightenment can never be accounted for, because to do so is to place it, as Tsung-Mi does, within a conceptual structure with its own strictures of rationality. The subitist insists that enlightenment is an experience of breaking through all such structures, and for that reason it is ultimately ineffable. To say anything at all about enlightenment is to impose structure upon it, no matter how deftly or obliquely done. A necessary corollary to any thoroughgoing and consistent attempt to apply the subitist stance would thus be an apophatic approach to language. In the end, the subitist relies on silence, but even this must be regarded as symbolic, for silence can only be interpreted within some context of discourse. When taken seriously, subitism is a position that by its very nature transcends articulation, for to articulate it coherently is to resort to the expedients of linguistic convention, in which both explicit and implicit conceptual structures are inextricably embedded. Subitism, then, for all the appeal of its uncompromising stance, leads to a set of curious and intractable problems when it is applied to practice. The apophatic rhetorical posture makes it impossible to say anything concrete about the actual experience of the practice of meditation. Taken by itself, it is easy to see how it might be possible for such a posture to be interpreted in a way that undermines religious and ethical practice. Tsung-Mi seems to have been well aware of this possibility, since he came from a part of China where a number of extreme applications of Chan doctrine had gained currency by his day. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to characterize Tsung-Mi simply as a gradualist. The doctrine of suddenness is essential to his own sense of identity as a successor in Shenhui's teaching line, and the experience of sudden enlightenment serves as his criterion for gauging the authenticity of Chan teachings on practice. Tsung-Mi's own position is too complex and subtle to be categorized as simply that of a subitist or a gradualist, just as his use of the essence-function paradigm makes it impossible to characterize his thought as conforming to either a dualistic or a non-dualistic model. Tsung-Mi's position on the sudden gradual issue seems in many respects to be unique. For example, in his explanation of the nature and function of religious language, Tsung-Mi claims that the sudden teaching is precisely that which is able to reveal the essence with a single word. He defines the ultimate teaching, which he identifies with the Hozi line, as that which reveals the nature immediately. Because it reveals the nature without resorting to expedients, it is also sudden, and it does so by using the single word awareness, ji. Tsung-Mi interprets the famous phrase, the single word awareness is the gate of all mysteries, which he attributes to Shenhui, to mean that Shenhui used the single word directly to reveal the truth. The sudden teaching is therefore the teaching that enables one to experience sudden enlightenment. He thus defines suddenness in terms of its ability to use language positively to reveal the truth. In a very broad sense, we can see the sudden gradual polarity as part of a larger dialectic in Buddhism. On the one hand, there is a need to create structures to give meaning and direction to practice. As a soteriological system deeply concerned with the practical task of motivating and guiding its followers, Buddhism requires a coherent vision of the nature and structure of the path. Such conceptual maps orient the practitioner, locating him in relation to his ultimate goal and thereby clarifying his task. Since such maps may also ground their pictures of the course of practice within a broader understanding of the ontological structure of reality, as Tsung-Mi's threefold theory of insight, cultivation, and realization does within his understanding of the fundamental nature of the mind as the ultimate source of all appearances, they may also serve to motivate and sustain practice by giving the practitioner confidence in his ability to realize the goal, because the path he is following is part of the very nature of things. On the other hand, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that conceptual maps are only expedient devices that must be cast aside after they have served their purpose. If the practitioner becomes attached to any map as being a true picture of reality, it becomes an obstacle thwarting the very realization of that to which it is intended to lead. Buddhism thus has the equally important need continually to deconstruct those very structures it is called upon to create. From the hard edge of the subitist position, all means, upaya, must be rejected as conceptual traps. Given these seemingly discordant attitudes, often represented in Buddhist discourse by the distinction between conventional and ultimate truth, one could say that both stances are needed for balance, that a one-sided subitism can subvert practice just as a one-sided gradualism can stifle realization, and that what is crucial is the vitality of the tension generated between them. But to say this is to take a tack not unsimilar to that of Tsung-Mi, and of course, to side with the gradualists. Appendix 1. Chengguan's scheme of sudden gradual combinations. Tsung-Mi's analysis of the 5 permutations of sudden and gradual as applied to enlightenment and cultivation is derived from Chengguan in his Huayan Qingyan Yi Zhao and Huayan Qing Sheng Yuan Bin Shu. Chengguan gives 2 slightly different but overlapping schemes, which, when combined, result in the 5 permutations outlined by Tsung-Mi. Most importantly, Tsung-Mi adopted Chengguan's distinction between Qiawu and Chengwu. Nevertheless, even though Tsung-Mi takes over the 5 permutations enumerated by Chengguan, his description of their content is often quite different. He also uses them for a different purpose. Whereas Chengguan's account claims to be purely descriptive and makes no value judgments as to the relative merits of the various positions, Tsung-Mi's analysis serves to demonstrate the superiority of Shen Hui's teaching. The differences between Chengguan's and Tsung-Mi's analyses is also discussed by Jinul in his Popchip Pyorheng Nok Choryo Pyongyip Sagi. For bibliographical references, see Note 17 below. In order to provide a basis for comparison, a translation of the relevant sections from Chengguan's 2 works follows. 1. Sudden Enlightenment and Gradual Cultivation, from Sheng Yuan Pin Shu. The case of sudden enlightenment and gradual cultivation involves enlightenment of insight, Jie Wu. That is to say, in the case in which one clearly intuits the nature of the mind and then engages in the training of gradual cultivation so as to make oneself come into full accord with it, enlightenment is like the shining of the sun, following Jinul. The other manuscript has moon, which suddenly illuminates all things, and cultivation is like the wiping of a mirror, which becomes gradually more lustrous and bright. From Yani Zhao. Sudden enlightenment and gradual cultivation is like seeing a 9-story tower. Although it is seen suddenly, it is only after one has ascended the stairs that one reaches the top. 2. Gradual cultivation and sudden enlightenment, from Sheng Yuan Bin Shu. The case of gradual cultivation and sudden enlightenment means that only after having first assimilated objects so that there is only mind, and then observing the intrinsic purity of the mind, our mind, and its objects both tranquil, there is then not even the slightest stirring of thought, and the succession of past and future thought is sundered. The mind is as limpid as a calm ocean and as vast as empty space. Since this case involves enlightenment of realization, Chengwu, cultivation is like polishing a mirror, and enlightenment is like the mirror's luminous reflectivity. 3. Sudden cultivation and gradual enlightenment, from Yani Chao. Sudden cultivation and gradual enlightenment is like burnishing a bronze mirror. Although one burnishes the entire surface at a time, its becoming bright and clear is gradual. Although the myriad practices are suddenly cultivated, enlightenment is only gradually perfected. This case involves enlightenment of realization, Zhengwu. 4. Gradual cultivation and gradual enlightenment, from Sheng Yuan Bin Shu. The case of gradual cultivation and gradual enlightenment also involves enlightenment of realization, Chengwu. Here cultivation and enlightenment are both like ascending a tower. As one gradually climbs higher, one's gaze gradually extends further. From Yan Ni Chao. Gradual cultivation and gradual enlightenment is like cutting sections of bamboo. The sections are not the same. 5. Sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation, from Sheng Yuan Pin Shu. The case of sudden enlightenment and sudden cultivation includes 3 meanings. A. In the case of being suddenly enlightened and subsequently engaging in cultivation, a broad and sudden intuition is called enlightenment, and fully merging with the way without either observing or purifying. Chang, controlling, shou, or assimilating, she, is called cultivation. This is a case of enlightenment of insight, jie wu, and it takes samadhi as its means of access. Again, it is like a mirror which is of itself luminously reflective without having to be wiped or polished. B. In the case of initially engaging in cultivation and subsequently being enlightened, abruptly seeing the nature of the mind as a result of having previously engaged in cultivation is called enlightenment. This is a case of enlightenment of realization, Zhengwu, in which cultivation is like taking medicine, and enlightenment is like curing the ailment. C. In the case where cultivation and enlightenment are simultaneous, when no mind is shining in forgetfulness, it is naturally tranquil and aware. This is a case of samadhi and prajna operating concurrently. No mind, like a luminous mirror, suddenly reflects all things. Here enlightenment encompasses, following Jinul, Dong, the other manuscript has Dao, both insight, Jie, and realization, Zhang. From Yan Ni Chao. Sudden cultivation and sudden enlightenment is like a sharp sword cutting silk. When 1,000 strands are cut, they are all simultaneously severed. Or again, it is like dyeing 1,000 strands of silk. When they are all simultaneously immersed in the dye, they at once become colored. Thus, when the myriad practices are all cultivated, they are simultaneously brightly enlightened. Appendix 2. The structure of the awakening of faith. At the top of the diagram is one mind, and then it branches into absolute aspect on the left and conditioned aspect on the right. Following absolute aspect, we branch into transcends words on the left and then predicated in words on the right, and under predicated in words, empty versus non-empty. Under the conditioned aspect of the one mind, we have the alaya vijnana. So that branches into enlightened and unenlightened. And down the unenlightened branch, we have the three subtle stages of phenomenal appearance: activity of ignorance, perceiving subject, and objects of perception. And then under that, we have 6 core stages of phenomenal appearance: discrimination, continuity, attachment, symbolic representation, giving rise to karma, and experiencing suffering. Appendix 3. A comparison of Tsung-Mi's stages of phenomenal evolution and the awakening of faith. So in the awakening of faith, we have one mind, alaya vijnana, enlightened mode, unenlightened mode, activity of ignorance, perceiving subject, perceiving objects, discrimination, continuity, attachment, symbolic representation, generating karma, and suffering of karmic bondage. And in Tsung-Mi, we have 1. Intrinsic enlightenment, 2. Unenlightenment, 3. Arising of thoughts, 4. Arising of the perceiving subject, 5. Manifestation of perceived objects, 6. Attachment to things, 7. Attachment to self, 8. Defilements, 9. Generating karma, and 10. Experiencing the consequences.